Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first broadcast of the Occupy Local podcast. What we're going to do here tonight is we're going to go ahead and watch the film about Occupy Wall Street. Tonight is just an opportunity to watch that film together as a group, comment on it, and as we comment on it, we'll get to learn something from the things that went right with the movement and the things that went wrong with the movement. We will basically be able to um, we will be able to learn something from watching this film that can help as we start to reboot the whole process of Occupy Wall Street. I'm going to be making comments as the film goes. And I'm also, if you want to make comments, go ahead and type them in the comments section. But now I'm going to go ahead and start the film. On September 17th, 2011, in New York City.
If I was in town from an 8-month excursion, I had no media access at all, and I asked you, what is Occupy? How would you respond?
Occupy Wall Street is a reaction to the toxic corporate culture in which we live. It is a tactic in which people put themselves in inconvenient places to garner attention to the problem of wealth and resource inequality that is caused by a toxic relationship between big business and media and our government.
Well, all right. That's a simple explanation. Feel free to leave comments, and I will show them how to read them.
What was the actual genesis moment?
Around the time of when Tunisia first happened, after a lot of interesting anarchic stuff that had been happening in Greece and Spain to some degree, and then of course there was regime change in Egypt. We're really in a situation in America where there's also a kind of a corporatocracy, I guess you could call it, or a regime there. And in our brainstorms, we said to ourselves, we need a regime change in America as well. And we came to the conclusion that there is nothing more sexy, there's nothing more exciting than occupying the very iconic heart of global capitalism, which is Wall Street, and to start our revolution there.
Mass arrests in New York today.
What's being called a mass day of action for the movement battling corporate greed.
With protests planned in many Occupy cities, including New York, LA, Portland, London, and Madrid.
New York City's Lower Manhattan still by far the largest.
Will the demonstrations continue, and will they remain peaceful?
The reason it doesn't have to be violent is because there's millions of us, and there's only really a few hundred of them.
And I think it understood where power lay, that it was outside of Wall Street, not out of Washington.
Our country's biggest banks were, and I quote here, shoddy, risky, and deceptive.
But you get to keep $480 million. Is this fair?
It's infuriating because the banks look at you like you're lazy. The politicians look at you like, oh, you just want a handout. I'm like, you motherfuckers, take a shower and they can get a job. Here's my wages stagnant. Here's my cost of living going up. What did I fill the gap with? Debt. So I went into debt and then I got poor and I couldn't afford basic shit. And you're going to call me lazy?
If you are envious of somebody that happens to be rich, that you call a fat cat, go and get rich.
I'm telling you, these guys need to start creating jobs, or we're going to start building guillotines. And I only say that jestingly, but, you know, if someone takes me up on it.
Of course, as you know, the Occupy movement is like a jazz orchestra. There's no one.
Cornell West.
All the voices are lifted. and it's a conversation.
You either go with the movement and you're pushing the movement forward, or you stand in the way. Well, if you choose to stand in the way, the movement is like water. It just goes around you. So you can't really stop it short of extreme violence against the people who are perpetuating it. And I think we've seen all these examples from the past where people try to suppress ideas with violence, that it never works.
Its weaknesses. Well, there are a lot. Historically, infighting in social movements has been the number one cause of it falling apart.
Now a question mark is hanging over the movement. We're wondering where it's going to go next. Some people say it's dead.
There's one threat to Occupy. What is it?
I think it's ourselves.
Yes. Occupy the movie. Make sure you leave your comments and I'll show them on the screen and we can discuss them either during the movie or after.
It's crucial that we understand the nature of this particular moment in the capitalist economy. This is not true just for the United States. This is true for the system as a whole. And what this means then is that we have to be able to tell an analytical narrative, tell an analytical story of what some of the causes of the wealth inequality are.
There was one meme that really hits it home. We've all chanted it. It goes something like this. Banks got bailed out, we got sold out.
Pretty much.
Enough said?
Why are we called Northern Tool and Equipment and not Northern Tool and Tomfoolery? Unlike the big box stores, you get the heavy-duty stuff you want without the lightweight stuff you don't.
Wow.
Northern Tool.
That's us getting sold out again, man.
In terms of allocating public resources, the government's response to the financial crisis of 2005 to now represents the largest commitment of public resources to any project since the beginning of the country.
I thank the chair. Well, Secretary Paulson has submitted a simple proposal to Congress. This is it, 3 pages. It's about $1 billion a word, and it is quite simple. Secretary Paulson gets the key to the Treasury. He can start off by borrowing $700 billion in the name of the American people, maybe more later. And it waives all laws, no oversight, no one looking over his shoulder, no conflict of interest rules.
I am convinced that this bold approach will cost American families far less than the alternative. A continuing series of financial institution failures and frozen credit markets unable to fund everyday needs and economic expansion. Again, I'm frustrated. The taxpayer is on the hook. The taxpayer is already on the hook. The taxpayer already is going to suffer the consequences. And so the best protection for the taxpayer and the first protection for the taxpayer is to have this work.
Leaders here in Washington reached an extraordinary agreement to deal with an extraordinary problem in our economy. Working closely with my administration, congressional leaders from both parties produced the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act. Bold bill. This bill commits up to $700 billion taxpayer dollars. Every member of Congress and every American should keep in mind. A vote for this bill is a vote to prevent economic damage to you and your community.
I mean, that was a redistribution of wealth under Bush, and it carried through with Obama. And in the process of these bailouts was a redistribution of wealth upward. Again, that was indicative of the people having to fend for themselves.
There are firms in this country which are too big to fail.
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 The whole concept of
Too big to fail is the biggest load of crap I ever heard in my life. We are small and we always fail, and they don't care. And then they start talking about too big to fail. Man, that always burns me up when I hear that.
Too big to fail. That's distorting markets all over the place.
The logic behind the too big to fail movement was that there are certain entities, certain banks that are so big they cannot fail without dragging down the rest of the financial world. Absolute nonsense. A goldfish doodle. Banks have been failing for the 2,000 or 3,000 years that we've been having banks. Probably before 3,000 years when you had cavemen trading rocks, basically. One caveman had too many rocks he couldn't carry. He fell, broke his leg, he's out of business. Did cavemen stop existing? Did rocks stop? No. They had another guy who picked up the rocks and started doing business.
The banks actually got bigger, right? In the aftermath, and where we ended up now with institutions that are even too bigger to fail than they were before.
Now you have JP Morgan, which in my opinion is nowhere near as healthy as alleged, and just swallowing monetary mutual and Bear Stearns alone. The problem is, if you're healthy, you're not going to remain healthy if you consistently eat sick things. Lehman was the lone, bank, the smallest of all, by the way, that was allowed to go bust. Bank of America bought Countrywide and Merrill Lynch, right? Those two entities alone could have been enough to bring the system down, right? Now you have Bank of America swallowing both of them, with Bank of America having its own problems. Bank of America is a walking zombie right now.
What would we do if we wanted to eliminate too big to fail? If we wanted to, what would be the steps that we would take?
Well, I think the first thing you have to say, as a minimum, is to either raise capital charges or raise fees, but you cannot allow it to go on without very serious consequences.
We need to break up the too big to fail banks. We need to break up these big monopolies, because if we don't break them up, at some point they break us up.
And that's why I don't think you hear a lot of people being angry about Bill Gates, even. Bill Gates is not a great enemy of Occupy, right? Ben and Jerry's are not great enemies of Occupy. Google is not a great enemy of Occupy yet. Hopefully it'll stay that way. Who is the enemy of Occupy? The banks, because the banks are, in Matt's legendary phrase, a great vampire squid on the face of humanity, sticking its blood funnel in anything that smells like money.
I guess where I want to start is the bank. I think a lot
where
of
are
people
we today?
now, when they
Same
talk
crap,
to banks, corporations, they bundle them together. What are these institutions? How are they structured, and are they structurally going to always lead to failure as they did in 2008?
I think a bank really can be understood as being two things. One is a utility. It is like water, light, air. It's something people have to have in order to maintain anything like the level of civilization that we now do.
Banks are critical. They're critical for economic growth, small business, big business, home ownership. They're an essential institution.
The other part of what people call bank is a gambling casino. And the difficulty that we've run into is that we conjoined the gambling casino with the bank. And when the casino gambled and lost, the money came out of the guarantee by the government of the utility function of the bank.
Historically, what led to that conjoining?
Well, historically, it's quite strange. And I can speak with a certain amount of passion and experiences. I used to be chairman of a bank, and I ultimately sold the bank to perhaps the single individual who most well explains the rise of the bank. And he's a man named Sandy Weil. As is so often the case in both democracies and in large corporations, a single individual explains most everything. And Sandy Weil essentially was a man who understood power. And he had the impression that by building the thing that was the biggest, he could build the thing that was the best and that was the most enriching. And ultimately being able to induce virtually all of the governmental officials at the end of the Clinton administration, and they overruled Glass-Steagall. And so he ended up with the ultimate institution. It provided every kind of financial service to everybody, everywhere, one-stop shopping. In order to meet the competition that Weil's bank presented. Blankfein had a difficult problem running Goldman Sachs, because at that time, while Sandy Weil was building this, a Goldman Sachs was a partnership. And a partnership is very, very, very different than a corporation.
Where you have partners who pulled together, they took their capital, they put it into a partnership, they did business, they made money, and then they reinvested their money.
Goldman Sachs then became a corporation. It then became a public corporation. Then it became a very large public corporation. And they thereby changed their character really violently.
The risk that you see going on in investment banks being blown up was unheard of just a few years ago. The reason why you have that now, and you didn't have it back then, is because investment banks are using OPM, other people's money. They were able to lever up and take risks, because the risk they were taking now was primarily public stockholders' money. When you're using someone else's money, you can be extremely, extremely risky, which brings in the investment bank cartel, the investment banking industry.
So what Sandy Weil had done through guts and perseverance and just plain chutzpah, now became legal for anybody to do.
I want to get to that high unemployment because that is one of the things driving these Occupy Wall Street protests that have been happening all over New York City. What is your thought about these protests? Do you think that the anger towards big banks like Citigroup, for example, is merited?
What I really think is that it's time to stop pointing fingers about the past. If we are so possessed with thinking about the past and pointing fingers, we're not going to get moving.
Yeah, because then you'll be held accountable for what you did.
The 2024 Kia Sportage was built for adventure.
Because they want you to
Sportage
be held
offers
accountable for what
unmistakable
you did,
style.
dude. Come on. They all need to be held accountable.
Former CEO Sandy Weil now says he would support breaking up the biggest banks. His comments touched off a firestorm across Wall Street.
What I think mostly is that there is such a feeling among people all over the world against the banking system, and I don't think that's going to change so soon. So I think what we should probably do is go and split up investment banking from banking, have banks do something that's not going to risk the taxpayer dollars, that's not going to be too big to fail.
You would never expect something like that to come out of Sandy Weil's mouth.
I mean, the person who created the animal now wants to kill the animal.
That's a pretty radical idea, though. The idea of breaking up the investment banks and the banks. Are you suggesting going back and really breaking these companies up?
That's exactly what I'm suggesting. So I want to see the United States be the leader. And we're not going to be a leader if we keep on trashing our institutions.
I don't know what happened to this guy. Maybe he had like one of those like near-death experiences or something.
Sam Cedar.
Or he just figured, I've made all my money.
Sam Cedar. I love the Majority Report. I wonder if they're going to show Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. That's where I was when the whole Occupy Wall Street was going on. And they actually had tents. They weren't just sleeping on
Manhattan has a very cloistered pedestrian vibe.
You walk down the street and you look forward and you don't talk to anyone. Like, that's how this works.
There's 20 million people living in this metropolitan area and no place for us to mass assemble.
And we started hearing about it from various people in New York. And I just remember thinking, well, yeah, good luck, right? Like, you're going to occupy Wall Street. Okay, totally impossible. And I've got other things to do. And then it happened.
When people get determined, they can do so many things.
The core impulse behind Occupy is this feeling that hundreds of millions of young people around the world have, that the future, their future, just doesn't compute. Their life is going to be full of ecological crisis and climate change and tipping points and financial crisis and an inability to pay off your loans, and you're never going to be able to live the kind of life that your parents lived. And if you want to have any kind of a future, then you have to fight for that future.
This was the outburst. This was the tantrum, the rebellion that had to happen. You had to take over, physically occupy parks and spaces and endure beatings from police telling you you could not do it. We had to do that as a tactic to wake this country up.
It's my fourth night. I have a kind of a roommate
I've been here since 12 o'clock last night. I intend to stay for 30 hours since I have class at 12 o'clock tomorrow, so.
It was a kind of utopian theater. It was a place where people could just go and act out what they thought a revolutionary society would look like on a very small scale.
And I think that's part of why it was able to sustain the attention for so long of the media. It provided so many interesting and rich questions and so many interesting answers. It was kind of like a reporter's playground.
The kitchen went very quickly from feeding, doing a few hundred meals to doing thousands of meals a day. We were actually at that point were the largest soup kitchen in New York.
I'm with the medic crew here at Occupy Wall Street. I've treated some basic things, cut fingers, coughs and colds.
And I've lived across from Zuccotti Park. There was nothing going in that park before Occupy.
And I bet you any money that all the business immediately around the park experienced huge jumps in profits during that time.
I'm Corey. What's your name? I'm Corey. Sam.
Sam, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, buddy.
Just wanted to know, what did you think about Occupy when they were here?
I don't know, I don't speak English, buddy. Sorry about that.
Yeah, you do. Were they good for business or bad for business?
I don't speak English. I'm eating.
The Occupy Wall Street protesters continue to call Lower Manhattan home.
There are questions about exactly what it wants and, more importantly, how it plans to get it.
Occupy, by standing for so many things and really refusing to strategize in some ways, may have missed the boat.
And now, this Occupy movement, which last year felt like it would never fizzle out, all of a sudden, even that movement is in danger of fizzling out. So I think the real trick to learn is to how to be energized, how to be spontaneous, and how to play jazz.
Since launching this campaign, we've seen tremendous momentum on the campaign trail. And this truly is a people-powered movement.
Occupy didn't work. Too many ads.
Right at the beginning of Occupy, there was a moment, I think, that really was the birth of Occupy more than almost any single moment. And that was the second weekend of Occupy Wall Street.
During a march up to Union Square, the police decided that enough was enough after occupiers had taken the street and kettled the marchers with orange nets surrounding them and trapping them.
And one officer, Officer Bologna, came up and pepper sprayed the women in the face.
That's come on.
The days after that were really interesting at Liberty Plaza at Zuccotti Park because suddenly a lot more reporters were there. On October 1st, there was a big march called, and it began in Liberty Plaza and Zuccotti Park, and a couple thousand people rallied there and began marching, and the plan was to cross the Brooklyn Bridge. The plan that the Direct Action Working Group had made and publicized was primarily to go over the pedestrian walkway, but then another group of people decided to actually go onto the road.
What happened on Brooklyn Bridge is going to be a stain on the city for a long time to come.
They got about a third of the way across the bridge. They were stopped by police nets and a blockade, and the NYPD proceeded to arrest everyone who was there including journalists, including children.
People of New York who were trying to express peacefully a point of view were attacked for having that point of view.
I think it was 3 or 4 weeks in, I woke up, it was Sunday morning, and I opened the New York Times, and I realized half the paper, literally, was dedicated to Occupy. It was setting everyone's mind on fire.
Then the next thing you know, it's all over the place. It's in Boston, it's in Philadelphia, it's in Oakland, it's in a whole range of places all over the country. It proliferated pretty quickly, and that's when I really began to think, oh, this is something.
I wonder if it could happen again. I wonder if we could get the whole world to occupy and change things. I wonder if it could happen again.
Left to run. If we lose America, we lose the world to the elite. The 1% will continue to get rich as we all live like slaves. If you think the way of life is bad now, you will all be living in projects like Hooverville. We need to end the Federal Reserve.
What is the Federal Reserve?
The Federal Reserve is a quasi-private or a private bank that basically acts as a bank to the banks. I follow this stuff fairly well, and I'm not sure I know what the Federal Reserve is. It's basically a big black box, a big mystery.
Hi, I'm Ben Bernanke, Chairman of the Federal Reserve System.
Hello, I'm Steve Meyer. I'm an economist here at the Federal Reserve in Washington.
The Fed, as it's often called, is the central bank of the United States.
The Congress created the Fed and made it responsible for monetary policy.
That is, the government-controlled bank or a government-related bank that will be the standard for issuing the pieces of paper that will be the substitute for carrying around inordinate numbers of gold coins in order to conduct business.
The Federal Reserve also helps to supervise and regulate the nation's banks and works to promote a stable financial system.
Jamie Dimon is on the governing body of the Federal Reserve. So let me get this straight. The guy who's in charge of one of the big banks is also in charge of the organization that's supposed to be applying oversight to the big banks. Yeah, it's kind of literally like putting the fox in charge of the hen house.
That Jamie Dimon is on the board of the New York Fed is just very consistent with the origins of the Fed, which was this bargain that created a semi-government, semi-private central bank.
The Federal Reserve was set up in the wake of an enormous financial crisis in 1905, in which Wall Street melted down, the economy started to melt down, and there was no Federal Reserve.
At the time of that crisis, the policy response came solely from private bankers centered around J.P. Morgan,
who was the most influential banker, most powerful banker in the country, essentially rallied other large banks in New York to provide the emergency lending needed to get the economy back on its feet. That drew the attention of lots of people who asked the question, why are we turning over the health of the economy in terms of its recovery to J.P. Morgan and a handful of other wealthy bankers? Because it's quite clear that Morgan made an enormous amount of money in the way that he structured the recovery. When the Federal Reserve was then set up, the Republicans and Democrats, you may have heard about this, didn't trust one another enough to believe that if it was a directly supervised entity, that politics wouldn't enter in. And the bankers were very reluctant, for their own reasons, to join a system that risked that kind of political pressure on them from elected officials in Washington. So the bank was set up as nominally independent.
As we learned during the financial crisis, financial instability can pose a severe threat to the broader economy.
So the Fed reduced short-term interest rates sharply, about as low as possible. Even so, output and employment continued to shrink. The Fed decided it needed to do more.
And what it does is it's been going out to the banks and it's saying, all right, we'll buy those toxic mortgage packages from you and we'll give you cash for them.
Slow, clogged, backed up,
another
drain problems can
commercial.
stink. Luckily, the professionals at Dean's have got your back. We'll send a service professional to your home to clear your main sewer drain.
The Fed bought a large amount of bonds and other longer-term securities, about $1.7 trillion in total.
Because in effect, in 2008 and 2009, nobody wanted to buy any of those packages and their effective net worth was zero.
You may wonder how the Fed pays for the bonds and other securities it buys. The Fed does not pay with paper money. Instead, the Fed pays the seller's bank using newly created electronic funds, and the bank adds those funds to the seller's account. The seller can spend the funds or can simply leave them in the bank.
That's fake money that they printed out of thin air. Fiat money. It's a fiat currency. Ones and zeros.
7 years ago, the Federal Reserve is a totally different animal than it is now. Right now, the Federal Reserve, the closest approximation could be a gigantic, dynamic hedge fund with unlimited leverage capability and the inability to be taken to task by its shareholders and investors.
Answers to no one. Amazing. I don't think a lot of people understand that's how the whole system works. Chapter 4, I am not moving.
In every movement, there are acts of resistance and there are acts of alternative building. For Gandhi, for instance, the alternative building was far more important and took up far more of his energy actually on a day-to-day basis than the resistance actions. And he thought they were far more important. So I think that the occupiers' emphasis on the occupations and on creating the life there, is not out of keeping with the tradition of effective resistance movements.
The city has taken the position that none of the activities that really formed the heart of the physical occupation, aside from the mere fact of gathering, are protected under the First Amendment.
So he announced that the park was going to be cleared. And that night, thousands of people, Teamsters and party promoters from Brooklyn and homeless street kids and old ladies, they cleaned the park on their hands and knees. They cleaned it. And then they stood in solidarity all night and said, no, you're not going to clear the park. And Bloomberg backed down.
In New York's Zuccotti Park all morning long, a confrontation between police and Occupy Wall Street protesters was avoided after the park owners canceled cleanup and decided the protesters can stay.
The real heroes of Zuccotti Park was the sanitation team. They worked harder and longer hours than most of the other working groups and really got very little credit. I mean, they saved us from getting evicted.
2 weeks after the failed...
I was in bed with like 104-degree fever.
Early snow.
And the snow hit and it just started going wild and everybody was getting hypothermic. I thought to myself, people could actually die out here.
Occupation is the central tactic for the Occupy movement. It's what put it on the map. It's what people did all over the country in order to identify with this movement and to unite their goals and aspirations. Of course, sometimes the means has become mistaken for the ends.
From after that first, real attempt to evict us, it was kind of a waiting game, like we knew they were going to try it again. We just didn't know when.
Over time, I've become increasingly concerned that the occupation was coming to pose a health and fire safety hazard to the protesters and to the surrounding community. But make no mistake, the final decision to act was mine and mine alone.
Well, the raid was brutal.
What's going on? What's going on?
Yeah.
He's beating the people with billy clubs now.
I remember this.
It's just a space that was so much to so many people and home to friends being wiped off the face of the earth.
I had left Spokes Council with Nicole.
Just had been coming off of a really exhausting day, period.
So we decided just to go home, get some food and relax.
We're like, I'm so tired. I'm like so stoked to like sleep. You know, I'm gonna sleep.
Around 12 o'clock, we get a text message the park is being raided. We were like, oh my God.
We just hopped in a cab and went back to Zuccotti Park.
It's completely locked down, 4-block radius.
And George was like running around and had all this energy. And I was like, are you kidding me?
I booked it and sprint inside. And it was great. The sanitation workers like were defense for me. Like,
somewhere they just got orders to like start pushing people back. Then like I saw them take it out and like start spraying. And it was like this very surreal moment before it was like, oh, like I'm being pepper sprayed right now.
And as soon as I get there, I sit down, I put a U-lock around my neck, lock myself down to the rest of my friends, and just wait.
We rushed to this convenience store and Sandy was there and she like made this concoction of water and milk and like doused us with it so that we could see again.
I was livid watching these garbage trucks just destroy everyone's property.
I just picked up a book. It's Brave New World Revisited by Aldous Huxley.
What do they do with everything?
They trashed it. They trashed everything.
Where are you taking this stuff? Guess to the thought. Again, say that again. Say that again. Don't say that.
Because it happened literally in the middle of the night and without any meaningful warning, those of us who wanted to provide some legal support were left in a position where we had to scramble and wake up a judge.
Judge Lucy Billings issued a court order, an injunction basically, a restraining order on the NYPD, but the NYPD refused to adhere to the court order.
The city thought that if they evicted us before our N17, that this was going to get us to stop protesting. And really what it did was, I think, swelled our ranks on N17.
Experiencing the eviction the night before and having that be on like the live stream that it was and having people see that, people came that morning with a lot more anger.
March up! March up! March up! Look at you now! Look at you now! Look how strong we are! Look how strong we are!
Well, Kevin, we're about 3 hours into this day-long Occupy Wall Street event marking the 2-month anniversary of this movement that began here in New York. Dozens of people have been arrested. Sound cannons have already been used. Women tackled to the ground and hauled off in vans.
At first, it was like a few dozen of us and a few hundred came behind us. And I stood in front of a wall of police, like walls and walls of police, with no fear. There was one point where like this cop's face was like literally an inch from mine. His scooter wheel was in between my legs. And I'm just up there with 2 peace signs yelling in his face, "We are peaceful. I am not moving."
Brendan, a bunch of blue shirts jumped the barricade, ran up to him, and they knocked him to the ground, bashing his head on a curb. They were stomping on his head. They were kicking him, and when they picked him up, it's just his whole face is covered in blood. You can see his teeth are knocked loose and totally out of it.
I wouldn't be a bit surprised if it was not blood on the occupier on MSNBC, but rather ketchup or stage blood.
My main feeling was, we're going to get through this, and hopefully this will make us stronger as activists and as people, and hopefully this will make our movement stronger. Hopefully we can do the press work after this to, show people that, look at what we're trying to do here. We're trying to sit in a park and talk.
That was awful, man. Didn't make a lot of sense.
We have to make sure that the promises we make in Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare are promises we can keep. And there are various ways of doing that. One is we could raise taxes on people. That's not the way. Corporations are people, my friend. We can raise taxes on. Of course they are. Everything corporations earn ultimately goes to people. So where do you think it goes? Whose pockets? Whose pockets? People's pockets. Okay, human beings, my friend.
I could probably grab any of these people off the sidewalk and say, what do you think of corporate personhood? Do you think that's a good idea?
No! Number one.
You think corporations should have the same rights as people? Do you think money is free speech? What do you think they'd say? I don't think they'd say, yeah, that's a really good idea.
The corporation has been evolving toward personhood, since the very beginning. Was its destiny. It kind of flipped into personhood in the Lincoln era.
After the Civil War, corporations were defined as individuals in court cases, in the law, as a way to think about the kind of legal identity of a corporation, of a business. I did not know that. This idea of money as speech, I think, is really, it is something that's fairly new. And we're already beginning to see just how horrible it is.
The law of the land was that a corporation is a person, that it is unconstitutional to restrain corporate speech. Now, what is corporate speech? I don't know, but the Supreme Court said corporate speech turns out to be money.
And that's really what the heart of Citizens United comes down to. If speech is free, then money should equal speech. Well, it's not free speech if someone paid for it.
The brazenness by which they're doing this is really quite stunning.
Now, if you don't know this, there's a group called ALEC. It's the business community which gets together and says, how can we basically buy all the politicians on the state and federal level and then actually hand them the piece of legislation and have them submit it and go, golly gee, I got this great idea to crush unions. Where did I get that from? We've got a Florida State Representative, Rachel Bergen, who put in a bill and forgot to take out the part that was actually in the memo about ALEC itself, okay? Get a load of what she submitted into the legislature. Quote, House Memorial. A memorial to the Congress of the United States urging Congress to cut federal corporate tax rate. Whereas it is the mission of the American Legislative Exchange Council to advance Jeffersonian principles of free markets, limited government, federalism, and individual liberty, and. You understand? That's the internal thing that they wrote, gave to the politicians, saying this is why it is our position. And that's, of course, ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council. Do you understand? They don't represent us at all. When she realized her mistake, 24 hours later, she pulled it in a panic, like, I didn't mean that, I didn't mean that. And then she resubmitted the same exact thing, just with that word, that sentence about ALEC taken out.
We've had what I call a capture by the Business Roundtable, Chamber of Commerce, large companies, of the power to control the allocation of resources in this country. And so resources that in the past might have been directed in ways that enhanced the public welfare are now being directed to industries that have participated in this capture of the governmental process.
Ian Murphy, editor of the Phoenix Online newspaper, with Wisconsin Republican Governor Scott Walker. Holding up New York's richest man, David Koch. The Koch empire has donated over $196 million to Republican front.
Hi, it's Scott Walker.
Scott, David Koch, how are you?
Hey, David. I'm good. And yourself?
I'm very well. A little disheartened by the situation there, but what's the latest?
We're actually hanging pretty tough. I mean, amazingly, there's a much smaller group of protesters, almost all of whom are in from other states today.
Now, who can we get to budge on this collective bargaining?
Well, I think in the end, I think the paycheck will have an impact.
Beautiful, beautiful. Got to crush that union.
Politicians are essentially corporate employees. They run errands for corporate lobbyists. They pass legislation written by corporate lobbyists, and when they get out of office, they become corporate lobbyists.
Corporate employees.
My friends on the, I don't know if you call them on the right. Is Kissinger on the right? I don't know what he is. Now tell me that it's well established in their circles that democracy didn't work.
The Obama administration, for its own reasons,
was very reluctant to begin a cycle of prosecution during its first term of office. And I can just imagine what the arguments were that the president heard. His economic advisors would have said to him, they will punish you badly in return if you try to prosecute some of them. That as a group, they will recognize that you are a threat to them. And when the 2012 campaign comes around, money that you, President Obama, actually raised on Wall Street, which was not insignificant, will go to your Republican opponent.
Wow. Wow.
The status quo is untenable. People that get elected aren't responsive to people that elect them, but they're responsive to global capital. And I think that was the break.
Wow. And everything they just said is still the case today.
Losing the park propelled us into this 2 to 3 month window where people were just like falling off because they no longer had a place to stay and they no longer had a constant food source.
I can understand a person becoming pessimistic or becoming more despairing because they want to go back to those first moments, those moments of unbelievable enthusiasm and intensity and passion. And no, you can't go back.
So the Occupy Wall Street movement is dead, finished as a legitimate political force in this country. And that's a good thing.
No one can keep a camp going at this point for longer than 2.5 months, whether that's an international camp in Spain or an Occupy camp in America.
In a way, losing the parks liberated the movement. In a way, it confused it.
One of its unique aspects is its absence of leadership structure. In fact, social movement theory would tell you that a social movement that doesn't have clear leadership, doesn't have clear goals, probably won't persist over a long period of time.
And
in some ways, Occupy has defied the odds.
One thing I think that you saw in Occupy is leaders who denied that they were leaders.
But let me just ask you, what is it like being a leader in this movement? I know that's a really tough word, but let's be honest, man. I've seen you at work. I've seen the people asking you for advice.
Little uncomfortable. We don't have a leader, but there are people steering the ship. I'm not going to lie to you. There are people who have influence in this movement.
So before I came to school today, I had coffee.
More recently, we have seen another new protest tactic gain some traction across the country, and that is the human mic, an Occupy Wall Street innovation. In the absence of a microphone, it's a means of communicating to a large group of people.
We amplify each other's voices! We amplify each other's voices!
It was so wild to actually see this in person. It was so effective. And he's smiling. What the hell?
No, it's okay.
We also want to show them alternatives to governance. The General Assembly, with its participatory nature, with listening to everybody's voice, even minority voices get heard so that the majority, which is often wrong, can hear a minority perspective and maybe change its view.
There are rules about speaking that are enforced by, particular people who are trained in mediating this discourse.
I have not become a big advocate or a fan of how the General Assembly process has manifested, particularly in New York. And in fact, it's really not even working anymore.
Put your finger in the air. Put your finger in the air. We'll be given a chance to speak. We'll be given a chance to speak.
I'm concerned
that
our general agenda usually takes quite some time. The working groups have quite a few important things to get across.
We would have GAs at church and we would have meetings at E5. And so it was just like, you'd go to work in the morning and you go straight there. Wow, I do not feel like going to GA today at all. There's this
doing anything.
The danger is that people are just trying to do too much and that they're going to burn themselves out.
In the end, they accomplish nothing.
Like, what's the
Because of
mechanics, man?
because
What's
of
the
that very
day-to-day of
structure.
being a leader in this movement? What do you got to do? What do you do every day?
Well, first of all, I don't like being in this position. It sucks. I want to go out on the road and take pictures again, but there's a lot of work to be done, and I don't know if I'll ever do that again. I'm on the phone most of the day and answering emails and settling rifts between different groups, and oftentimes I'm doing 20 things at once, and I haven't been home to see my father or my mother in almost a year, and it's hard to have a relationship with somebody. It's a paradox, because on one hand I'm saying that it sucks, but I think it's the best thing I've ever done, and I love it too. After the eviction, I spent like a whole winter in an office with 30 or 40 people trying to keep this thing alive, and we figured out how to organize outside of a centralized location, and we starved, and a lot of us didn't have anywhere to go, and you know, we cried and we comforted one another, and you know, those guys are my family.
Wow.
We find in Occupy that that our family can be involved. For us, this is literally about not only us as individuals, but what the world for our children look like.
My relationship with my daughter for the past year has been really tough. The year prior, her father and I split up, and then this started, and it was me being away. I mean, I thought it was literally going to be like a week, and I kept telling her, okay, next week I'll be done, or next week I'll be done.
And early on in the park, in Zuccotti Park, my wife and my son came down with me. My son is 3 years old. What we told him was that this was the people taking over what's already theirs.
She doesn't like activism right now. She was all for it until it started getting really messy. And we were actually on a march one weekend and almost got corralled by the cops, her and I. Since then, every time she sees a police vehicle or police person in the subway, she gets very jumpy.
And then he was in the video. And, you know, there's a part where we're singing, "I'm free," the chorus, and we're putting our fists up. And it turns out that so was he in the video, and he's putting his little fist up. People said to us when they saw us doing it, like, "Yo, that was beautiful, your baby was so great," and we had no clue.
Our friends were taking care of her. She was doing a lot of overnights during the week until finally in December, her father said to me, you know, maybe it'd be best if we just switched primary custody for 6 months or so. And so we did that in December, and it's been really hard because, you know, I'm a mom, she's my kid.
The words "power to the people," to him, have a picture in his mind now. There's a picture of what that means, and what that means is that people can come together, that there's just a lot of people can come together and have fun and share and have a lot of love in the environment, and that in and of itself is power to the people. Just people sharing space and love is power to the people in my son's 3-year-old mind.
I want this world to be better for her when she's older, but I also don't want her to lose me. And both could happen. Neither could happen. I don't know. Right now, the only thing she thinks about Occupy Wall Street is that it took her mom away. So it's hard.
propaganda war. I'm pretty sure that propaganda
Corporate
war
media is the devil because it's only run by 5 to 6 organizations.
So you have six people, essentially, the CEOs of these corporations, six entities deciding everything we see and hear.
Publications like the New York Times have a kind of unwritten credo, which is do not significantly alienate those on whom we depend for money and for access. And I worked there for 15 years.
You have, in some instances, MSNBC being way too nice.
Our history is a country founded by and invigorated by and reinvigorated by protest.
And then you have Fox News saying they're a bunch of crazy drug addicts doing ridiculous things.
Big government anarchists.
Spitting on a woman in a Coast Guard uniform.
They even have ties to terror groups.
It's really just people. There's a bunch of different kinds of people, good, bad, whatever.
Wow.
But generally, it's what they don't tell you. And this is especially true on the airwaves, where its news is only judged for its entertainment value.
Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, gave her first public address as a royal today.
Everybody at the wedding will be wearing a hat.
Everyone wears a hat.
You have to wear a hat.
My goodness, have you watched the video yet on YouTube? Unbelievable.
I'm extremely excited that I'll be able to Skype.
Mine. That is Casey Anthony.
Well, Kim and Chris fought over just about everything, from a naked yoga instructor in their apartment to Chris's clothes being all over the floor. That fight led to a ripped toenail.
He fell in love with me and I fell in love with him, and now my feelings have changed. At 30 years old, I thought I'd be married with kids, and I'm not.
Jeez.
The media has concocted illusions which are indescribable.
Kim Kardashians, they do sell. These things generate tremendous attention, tremendous titillation, tremendous stimulation, tremendous distraction, but generate big cash.
They're the same channels that have the interests of not changing our system, and the same Wall Street interests that elect our government, our presidents, our congressmen that write our laws. They're the same ones that run our media.
Well, Erin was on the opening night of her show out front. She's from the banking community. That's her world.
The Dow's down 110. Your financials are obviously leading it. Utilities are down, transports are down, drugs are down, retailers are down.
Understandably, she looks at the Occupy movement as a bunch of wealthy, angry children complaining about all these bankers and people who are trying to do right by them.
Seriously? The Occupy Wall Street protest entered its third week today. But what are they protesting? Nobody seems to know. So this afternoon, we went to Wall Street to find out.
The media that we're used to being indoctrinated with uses techniques.
They start looking for what they consider to be inconsistency.
What they do is the first question is to set you up.
What do you do for a living?
I'm a software developer.
Software developer.
Yes.
So currently employed or unemployed?
Unemployed. Unemployed, we like to call it.
Unemployed.
The second question is to make you look bad.
So do you know that taxpayers actually made money on the Wall Street bailout?
I was not aware of that.
They did.
The third question is to blame Democrats.
In fact, the only reason we haven't made all the TARP money back is actually GM.
Which isn't true. She was running around to people saying, do you know the bailout was paid back? And kids would go, no, I didn't. See?
Seriously? That's all it would take to put an end to the unrest.
The mainstream media represents the largest distraction from the real issues in our country that exists today. They've pre-written the fate of Occupy. In their book, it's all done. And it's not going to be depicted the way that it needs to be depicted if we rely upon those old institutions, those old structures. They're not going to inform people in the way that we need them to. So we build our own.
Wow.
What we are trying to do
globally, I think, is empower the citizens to become journalists just using their cell phones, and now training people how to take that immediate, real-time narrative from the streets and explain it. And the people who know how to explain it are going to be able to speak to the whole world.
And we can still do that.
So this is my light setup. I have
my God.
I have a heavy, I have a medium, and I have a light setup. Our live streaming is pretty simple. The simplest way to put it is I take my phone, I download the Ustream mobile app. You sign into your account, and then you literally press play as if you're recording on your phone normally, but it uses your data service to send the video over the internet to anybody who wants to watch it.
Wow.
So this is pretty much just, I've got threaded the cable to my phone.
The big limit for streaming is that the phones and the batteries in the phones are very small. So if you stream for like 1 hour, your phone is dead. So people usually have these little things attached to give them an extra 5-6 hours for streaming.
And then I use an external battery. It's a USB Energizer deal that keeps everything going. This is a Defender case. This is the case that I had when I was attacked.
Come off camera or you lose your fucking camera.
You guys are attacking me right now.
I'm not attacking shit.
Wow. Dude, stop advancing on me. They come at me. One guy puts his arm up to my hand, up my face. One person swings at me, hits my hand, and I'm backing up the whole time.
Put your channel right now. Camera away. Put your fucking camera away. Get the fuck out of here.
And I thought, this is one of the only windows into what's actually happening right now. And because these 4 people want to air out some tires, they think the world should not know what's about to happen. We'll get some kind of death threat. And then I've gotten the veiled mafioso threats like, hey, yeah, I like what you're doing. You might want to consider getting some protection for this next action I'm going to be at. You know what I'm saying? And I'm like, But I'm not worried about it.
All night last night, we heard from dozens of protesters and independent journalists about raids and traffic stops taking place across the city. Now, that kind of allegation is hard for us to confirm unless or until we see the kind of video that came into us from around 2 this morning.
We're being raided right now. For those that are watching, we are being raided by the CPD as we speak.
What is this for, officer? What is this for?
I'm unbuckling my seatbelt.
And we were cuffed, interrogated, credit card numbers were taken down, passport numbers, they banged our hard drives against the ground.
We contacted CPD about this incident, but we've not yet heard back. Danielle and Stefan, back to you.
It makes it harder for them to lie, because every time now they're lying about what happened, it becomes very easy to say, oh, you lied. Basically, we're creating an object that uses everything the movement is creating, so to speak, to fight the propaganda war.
That is amazing. I wonder if the Tim Pool event could see himself now what he would think. Tim Pool, can't believe it.
At Vistaprint, we print signs so people can see your brand up close.
Commercial.
But we also print signs so that people can see your business here, see it here, and see it here, so you stand out.
May Day was pretty intense. It was I had no idea what was going to happen. There was a lot of suspense building up to it. People were worried. You're talking about the Wildcat March, and that there's going to be, people thought it was going to be a lot of chaos.
Police say if you can avoid downtown Seattle and Portland, you should.
We were warned that May Day protests could spin out of control today, and that is exactly what happened.
We got there in time to see flares thrown up onto an upper tier and then rocks thrown at the big Nike windows. The panes came down.
Wells Fargo downtown sustained severe damage, windows shattered, glass showering upon the crowd. Police finally arrive. Self-proclaimed superhero Phoenix Jones tries to calm the crowd.
Published reports indicate the Black Bloc worldwide is synonymous with what many also called anarchists, that it is not an organization, but a tactic.
There was a moment when a lot of people in Occupy were debating, nonviolence versus diversity of tactics. whether it was okay to break a window every once in a while, it started getting really over-intellectual.
I wrote a column that called The Black Bloc, the Cancer of the Occupy Movement, because the power of the Occupy movement is precisely that it is a mainstream movement.
What's more mainstream than violence? Unfortunately, what's more mainstream than
The
that?
tactics of the Black Bloc, because it embraces petty vandalism and taunting the police, are not palatable within the mainstream, and a gift, therefore, to the security and surveillance state.
I don't even know what to say. I don't even know what the protests are for. It's stupid.
I think it's crazy. I think it's insane. Like, everybody who probably did it had a pair of Nikes on.
And I think taunting the police is very short-sighted.
The biggest threat to the Occupy movement, in my opinion, would be the inability to reconcile the reformists with the revolutionaries. And, you know, there's been an ongoing debate about the diversity of tactics. You have the revolutionaries who think
the diversity of tactics is necessary to maintain the broad coalition that Occupy has to have to be successful.
you have the reformists who actually make up the majority who think
if your goal is to be a mass movement, you want to do things that pull people toward you. The problem with breaking windows and looking for conflicts with the police is that there's the opposite. It pushes people away.
You know, the revolutionary faction is the one that kept the movement going, but the reformist is the one that makes the movement large. And so they need to come together and find a way to work together.
Wow. I can't believe that Tim Pool was that
The May Day March from Bryant Park
was
at the same time as the Wildcat March.
It was a rainy morning. We weren't sure how it would affect. We grew slowly, but you know, when we rolled out at 2:00, I think we were close to 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 strong.
My affinity group actually got saddled with leading that march. Our plan was just to go on the sidewalk and just do an unpermitted march that was very low risk and, you know, family friendly and everything. There was like this leaked communique that the police department had sent out. They were really worried about this Wildcat March, and so there was like a predicted huge mobilization for it. And so I think that pulled a lot of the cops.
We did a fabulous march from there, Bryant Park, down to Madison Square Parks, when the police were like, you know, you have to stay on the sidewalk, which was really putting, you know, pedestrians in a hard place because you're trying to run thousands of people down a sidewalk. It's not safe. And the police refused, and ultimately the people just couldn't be contained and ultimately took a lane in all of Fifth Avenue.
Lisa Fithian comes running up to me and she's like, just so you know, like the whole middle of the march is taking the street. And we're like, okay, all right. Thinking tactically about what it takes to take the street and where in the march that should come from, we've gotten better about that. Usually you'll have the front of the march that take the streets, but then you have the cops that are always there. So having it come from the middle, where they are usually thin, is just the way to go.
Would you really want to do that with a new Occupy? I think
You know, it was this beautiful cacophony of resistance. It was room for lots of stuff.
It was beautiful. The Wildcat March, I heard, was brutally repressed. So I think it's kind of a combination of the Wildcat March happening and also practice and you know, evolution of our tactics.
You know, on May Day, we filmed a Wildcat. There was a little bit of paint thrown on cop cars, a couple of garbage cans. It was a hostile aesthetic, if you will, but there was definitely no severe vandalism. They agreed to say no windows. That was the first thing they all agreed on. They said no windows. If the Black Bloc, you know, pulled that back, do you think that they could be rehabilitated as an ally of Occupy?
I think the secret of the success of Occupy, as Lisa Fithian and others have pointed out, is this one, transparency, which means don't cover your face, and two, nonviolence. And if there are Black Bloc elements that can live with that, there's certainly room for that.
Did you read Chris Hedges' article on Black Bloc?
I did read Chris Edge's article on Black Bloc. That, it really, it frustrates me, honestly. I don't think...
This way, 1 sec. This way. You're gonna have the military. Sorry, man. Just 1 sec.
Wow. The hell is that?
Well, the single biggest threat to Occupy is, without question, the security and surveillance state.
Ann Johnson Stewart is a radical, and she admits it.
Another commercial.
A super progressive, left-wing
And a
crazy
political one
Democrat.
at that, and it won't let me
voted
skip
against
it.
mandatory
Amazing.
minimum sentences for violent criminals and
Wow.
carjackers.
Make this a summer to share
Amazing.
in one of our capable SUVs. Visit.
This one I can't do.
In these staged demonstrations, the men dressed in black will typify hardcore professional agitators.
What they call martial law. They don't tell me what to do, man. I'm a civilian. You think that?
When the group refuses to disband, action must be taken. Note that the reinforcements approach in formation, organized, intact, and formidable. Since the people have no real interest or involvement in the issue, they fade away quickly, depriving the agitators of their most valuable weapon, the crowd.
Well, the power elite has always attempted to crush movements, anything that threatens their ability to dominate both political and economic systems.
Fire extinguisher can be utilized when men and equipment are in short supply. Spread on a corridor floor, the foam or a substitute high concentration of soap suds can work wonders. Watch.
Wow.
For the problem of an aroused, belligerent mob, a riot control agent is a practical, humane solution. A disperser provides the wider coverage necessary for such a large group.
We've seen externally the resources that they have employed to physically eradicate encampments. What we don't see are the massive internal effort that they are making to subvert and destroy the movement. And I think sometimes the Occupy people are a little naive about what they're up against.
And those of you listening on the phone that don't like what I'm doing, you can go fuck yourselves. But what are you? Yeah, my phone's being tapped too, by the way.
There's been a steady erosion under the Obama administration of basic civil liberties. They created all sorts of mechanisms to shut out all but the elite, whether that is the FISA Amendment Act, or warrantless wiretapping, monitoring, and eavesdropping of tens of millions of American citizens, whether that is the refusal to shutter Guantanamo and end our offshore penal colonies, whether that is the decision to serve as judge, jury, and executioner and order the assassination of American citizens, such as we saw with the Yemeni cleric Anwar al-Awlaki.
Wow.
And of course, the National Defense Authorization Act, signed into law on December 31st, 2011, which Section 1021 and Section 1022 permit the U.S. government to hold or seize an American citizen.
Can be detained without due process, can be detained without judicial process, and in fact, can also be assassinated.
Someone who substantially supports, whatever that means, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or something called associated forces.
And there is the problem that says associated forces. What does that mean?
It also talks about what actions would be deemed a threat. And one of the words they use is belligerence. Belligerence? I mean, I get belligerent when I'm on, at a traffic light I don't always stopped at.
to hold those people in military facilities until, in the language of the bill, the end of hostilities, which in an age of permanent war is forever. You don't want to hand that kind of power to the state because eventually they'll use it.
Chris Hedges brought a complaint. It's really a suit against the federal government.
I sued Barack Obama and Leon Panetta. I had a trial in a federal court.
Chris's situations are unique because he's a columnist, writer. He's traveled all over the world.
He has actually dealt with Al-Qaeda, dealt with what are labeled terrorist groups. So he would fit perfectly the kind of person who could be challenged by this.
You know, I'm not naive about the corporate dominance of the judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, but I think that, we shouldn't take pieces of legislation like this lying down.
A federal judge Wednesday struck down part of a controversial law signed by President Obama that gave the government the power to indefinitely detain anyone it considers a terrorism suspect, including U.S. citizens. Judge Catherine Forrest of the Southern District of New York struck down the indefinite detention provision, saying it likely violates the First and Fifth Amendments of U.S. citizens.
And 5 times, Judge Forrest asked the U.S. Attorney, will you agree that First Amendment activities will not bring someone under the scope of this law? And the government 5 times said, we can't answer that question.
What is the significance of this judge's ruling?
Well, it in essence invalidates that provision, Section 1021. So it's monumental because she threw the whole thing out.
Wow. One small victory. Death by complexity. And that was the problem with Occupy that I
always fantasizing. I say, if I were him, what would I do?
I looked at it.
And he comes in and there's an enormously collapsing situation. And the difficulty is that it appears as if this is a system that can break. And nobody really knows what to do not to have it break. But you know, if you break it, you're going to have a wasteland.
Hey, what's going on?
Notice to quit. Summons for eviction.
Eviction? Come on, you're not serious. I'm very serious. You want to see what it's like living here? I can't even take a working shower. Look at this. That usually doesn't happen.
Wall Street now lives in complexity and hides behind complexity and is in fact undone by complexity. I mean, I don't think that any of these big banks wanted to go through the last 4 years. They have fought their way through. They fought ferociously like Spartan warriors, but none of them wanted this experience.
How do you regulate complexity? It's my opinion that you cannot successfully regulate complexity because you have financial engineers whose sole job is to walk around regulation.
And so oftentimes policymakers don't understand the markets that they're trying to regulate. One of the things that happens in financial markets is they're so interconnected that oftentimes we don't know who is on which side of which trades. And so the impacts of a faulty product are not just between me and the person who sold it to me, but they might be between me and someone else that I've transacted with and the people that they've transacted with.
The fact of the matter is those instruments are very complicated, and it's the case that neither the purchaser nor the seller truly understands what's in them to the degree that prudent judgment would expect.
They're developed in many cases not to be transparent, yet regulators have to understand them well enough to know when they're making a valuable contribution to the economy and at which point they get dangerous.
A derivative is an instrument that derives its value from something else. For instance, the dollar bill was a derivative up until 1972, 73. If you take a dollar and say a dollar is backed by an 1/8 of ounce or a 1/16 ounce of gold, it's a very simple formula, 1-to-1 correlation, easy for everybody to understand. What makes derivatives a bad thing is once you start making complex with derivatives, you start losing the ability to value derivatives. Okay, if you change this derivative and say a dollar is based upon the fourth derivative of some complex formula based upon the color of the book bag behind you, only if the color of the book bag behind you matches the color of the book bag on the guy sitting on the corner of 42nd Street, who we won't tell you his name because it's a proprietary formula. And then that is linked upon 1/5 the value of gold, as long as the value of gold is the average of gold sold in 15 countries, of which we're only going to reveal 4 of those countries because the other 11 countries are part of our proprietary formula.
Wow.
In the US, 96% of the derivative market is shared between 5 individual entities, 5 banks, 96% of the risk. And they do business the exact same way. They stand as counterparties to each other.
What banks?
JP Morgan, Citibank, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and Bank of America. So that's the biggest problem with derivatives, okay? Complexity and a lack of transparency in reporting.
Wow. The Dodd-Frank Act, 848 pages. Wow.
The reforms under Dodd-Frank themselves have oftentimes been so complex that their complexity will provide a legal defense for those who don't abide by them, which is surely what will happen when the next meltdown comes.
As we've already seen with the major losses at JP Morgan, where they were attempting to comply with parts of Dodd-Frank, yet they were still able to lose $2 billion in a very quiet market.
We learned on Thursday that JP Morgan Chase lost $2 billion, that's billion with a B, from the derivatives trading desk.
It was a shocking announcement from JP Morgan Chase, the United States' largest bank based on assets.
Several news reports today also revealed that the FBI and the Justice Department are beginning their own investigation.
Generally, when the Department of Justice and FBI gets involved, it's generally because they suspect there's some sort of cover-up going on.
Regarding what happened, the synthetic credit portfolio was a strategy to hedge the firm's overall credit exposure, which is our largest risk overall in a stressed credit environment. We were reducing that hedge, but in hindsight, the new strategy was flawed, complex, and poorly monitored. It could cost us as much as $1 billion or more.
Just in real simple terms, in 6 weeks, you lost $2 billion. As simple as you can explain it, what went wrong?
You already mentioned there are huge moves in the marketplace. These are complex. We made these positions more complex. I'm not going to repeat it 800 times. I'm not going to get into more specifics than that.
In the following weeks, the derivatives did more damage to JP Morgan. Another road trade, $2 billion loss, grew to $4.4 billion, $5.8 billion, $7.5 billion, $9 billion. He was summoned to testify because of that. I don't blame him. I vaguely remember this. I'll know once he starts talking.
You sold my house for money. Why don't you face the people that you foreclosed on?
Stop! Foreclosure, stop!
Stop! Foreclosure, stop! You can get the one with $2 million, and you can't get her a modification payment. There's a day coming.
Foreclosure, stop! Stop! Foreclosure, stop!
Give her a homeland diamond. She's a paramedic. She's been fighting for your life.
Stop! Foreclosure, stop!
Wow. Never went to jail for the day. Jamie did not. When dissent is duty.
Jesus made his way to Jerusalem, ran out the money changers and said, "You will not make this house of prayer a den of thieves."
Jesus confronted the Pharisees, who were the lawgivers, who kept everything in order all along the way.
He was going up against not just organized religion. At that time, the temple represented Wall Street, Hollywood, White House, and Congress, because they were all together.
The system itself, when it makes a fetish of its own existence, that's an idolatry. And that's what's happened in the corporate life today.
So when he ran out the money changers, they were all tied to those elite institutions. So you knew he was going to the cross.
Wow.
One of my favorite quotes is a quote by Gandhi where he says, "I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. They are so unlike your Christ."
All that we are, including our rights, everything that we cherish, everything that we privilege, everything that we like best in ourselves, has its origins in dissent.
The long history of the United States has been a struggle on the part of populist movements to widen the space within the democracy.
When the United States was founded, it was founded by people who were being occupied. The founders were essentially insurgents.
Right, the Declaration of Independence is what I like to call the founding document of American protest literature. It's the first act of dissent that created the nation.
All of the rights, all of the privileges, everything we have was never given to us. People had to fight for it.
And yet, you know, as we know, it is oftentimes the case that people are fearful of those who are visionary and courageous. I think Occupy is the most significant social effort to build on Martin King's Poor People's Campaign, which was a massive sit-in in Washington, D.C. He wasn't able to execute it because he was assassinated.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. King was standing on the balcony of a second-floor hotel room tonight when, according to a companion, a shot was fired from across the street. In the friend's words, the bullet exploded in his face.
In fact, he did have a dream. He talked about it in his last speech in Memphis, Tennessee, the evening before he was assassinated. And his dream was, biblical theme, he said,
I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Powerful.
he was killed. The march took place after his death from Memphis. It was led by Coretta King, his wife. Set up a tent city in Washington, Resurrection City it was called.
Martin knew that if he could bring those folk to Washington, D.C., and engage in a dramatic action of staying there and maybe even shutting the city down for a day or two, there had to be a public conversation about the rich humanity and dignity of poor people.
This is the last chance, I think, for this country to sort of respond to the quiet and peaceful petitions of people who are asking for very, very just solutions to very, very real problems.
We are going to plague the pharaohs of this nation with plague after plague until they decide to give us some meaningful jobs and a guaranteed annual income.
They sent the security forces in, smashed up the tent city, drove them out of town. They had to flee Washington.
It is working down in Resurrection City. And please listen to that. That beautiful thing down there is just the top of a movement that stretches from coast to coast.
People have to think of the story of the monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly flies from Mexico all the way up north to Canada or Alaska. The butterfly that starts the journey is not the same butterfly that ends the journey. In fact, there are generations of butterflies that complete the journey. I think that's what we do with social change. Our role is to move social change forward. We may not get to Alaska or Canada, but we make it possible for others to get there too, and that's what we should be about.
Okay, so for me, the monumental thing about this is that it happened. It happened. And the plan is there. I want to thank the people who are watching, and I will be back next week in the hopes that more people will show up. But if I can't really get more people to show up, then it was at least nice being able to see that film and to see the origins of the Occupy movement, and to see that it is possible to motivate and move people. It may not be with what I do now. Next week will tell me that story. But at least this week we got to see the origins of the Occupy movement. And next week we will talk about what a new Occupy movement would look like, or at least I'll put forward an idea of what I think a new Occupy movement could be. And then from that, it's just a matter of forming it and coming up with something that everyone can agree on. And that's the one thing that I took away from it, is that Occupy failed because there was no one truly in control. The key to any movement like Occupy, I think, is having a central command and someone in control who maneuvers the pieces. And when you accomplish your goals, that person will trumpet. They then fade into the background and they don't become a figurehead. They're there to facilitate what the greater movement wants. Because as long as you have everyone with a voice, no one has a voice. So everyone has to voice what they need, and then they have to let the facilitator, that one person, be their voice for the greater world, because the greater world doesn't want to focus on millions of disparate people all over the world. They want to focus on one person speaking for those millions and making their voices heard. That is one place where I think Occupy failed at not having real leadership, because leadership is something that naturally occurs in the human condition. And those leaders will be sought out, and they will be leaders, even if not by name. So better to have them, better to utilize them, better to utilize that power that having leaders truly brings. I want to thank everyone who did watch, the people who watched and faded away, but this has definitely been well worth the time to celebrate or to commemorate the start of the Occupy movement back in 2011. It's now 2024, and most of the same things that were problems back then in 2011 are problems now. And I think that we need to come up with a solution. And a new Occupy movement done the right way with a good plan. I'm not saying I have all the plans, But I do believe if you get enough people together and enough planning is done, Occupy could be rebooted, could be revitalized, and could result in real changes to our banking system and to the things that continue to rob us blind to the tune of billions and billions and billions of dollars a year. Thank you again for watching, and this has been Occupy Local, a commemoration of the beginning of Occupy Wall Street.